Welcome to Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton, where we equip pastors to take their churches from declining to thriving by pointing them to a new future and a new hope. Join us weekly for encouragement and practical advice in your pastoring journey.
Welcome to Revitalize and Replant, where today we're going to swerve into the topic of deacons.
Oh, I love it. Deacons.
Deacons.
I love deacons.
Deacons.
Listen, can you think of
deacons?
When you think of godly deacons when you were younger?
Yes.
Is there one or two that come to mind?
Of course.
Who were they? What were
There
they
were
like?
many. A guy named Clyde Lineberger.
Clyde.
He was a sort of an insurance adjuster. Loved my dad, who was the pastor. Loved the church. Loved royal ambassadors. He was my RA leader, and so he would work all day Wednesday, and then he would come to the church, go to the basement, and a bunch of rowdy boys who wanted to pay no attention but just wanted to wrestle and fight. And he would teach us Bible stories. He would teach us about missionaries, and he would bribe us that if we would learn the Royal Ambassador Pledge and learn our Bible verse that week, we could cross the aisle behind the alley behind the church and go to Dairy Queen, and he would buy us a Mr. Misty.
No way.
And so we all did that. So
Deacon Clyde.
I don't really remember any particular lesson that Clyde Lineberger taught me, but I remember every Wednesday night, this man cared for us as boys.
Wow.
And he could have spent his Wednesday nights anywhere else, but he spent them there. And I remember how much he loved my dad. And I remember when my dad's mother passed away, I remember that night in our house, all these deacons came. And I was a young teenager when that happened. And I saw these deacons come and just hug on my dad and love my dad and cry with my dad. And I thought, man, what a wonderful picture. And just the way these men loved my dad and supported my dad, and he could lean on them. So I grew up with a very positive role of church deacons in my dad's life.
I love that.
Now, they were really functioning as elders. They didn't call it that. But my dad leaned into them to help him lead the church, pastor the church, hold him accountable. I mean, they function as deacons in terms of holding my dad accountable, caring for the church, being the real leaders of the church as well as my dad. But then they also function in a benevolence role. They took care of the poor and the indigent and the sick. So they tried to do both. And they did both relatively well. But that's how I remember deacons.
I love that. Well, here's what we know. We love deacons, and deacons are so important. And I meet a lot of young guys who aren't quite sure what to do with their deacons. How do we raise up deacons? How do we train deacons? And so what we want to do is today's podcast and the next podcast, we're going to do a 2-part series on deacons. And
you need deacons in your church.
Yes.
Now, there's no reason, if you have elders, you can have elders and deacons.
That's right. We do.
Yes.
That's right.
We did too.
Yeah.
We do here, we did at Warnell. Elders and deacons.
Yes.
Now, sometimes in some Southern Baptist churches, they don't want to have elders. And so in that sense, your deacons sort of serve both roles, okay? That's just the reality of it. We can talk about that too. But deacons are important. I don't want you to feel like, well, that was yesterday's church, and now we have elders. We don't have deacons.
That's right.
No. You need to have deacons.
There are two distinct roles in the New Testament, and they're both very, very important. And so what we're going to do, hopefully this podcast and the next could be actually a couple episodes you could listen to with your deacons or potential deacons to help bring clarity on what are we doing with our deacon ministry and why it's important. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about 5 marks of a faithful deacon. And then in the next podcast, we're going to talk about some of the specific duties of a deacon and what they're called to do. So let's begin, Clifton, with marks of a deacon. And the first mark that we see in the New Testament is a love for God, a love for the Lord. Why is it so important that deacons genuinely love Christ and love the Lord?
Because there have been on a few occasions some experiences, not really in my life, I mean that. The deacons that I know, this was not the case. But in working with some dysfunctional churches, I have come across this. Some deacons love authority, and they love to be in power, and they love to be in control. And you can't have a love of authority, a love of power, and a love of control as a deacon. You have to have a love of the Lord. That has to be the root of everything you have. And sometimes, especially in a smaller church, we're looking for deacons, and there's some men that just sort of stand out as guys who can lead things, who can get things done, who are there every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night. Man, they're Johnny on the spot. If the roof needs fixed, they're going to fix it. If something needs to be done, they're going to do it. Okay, that's all well and good, but what is their heart like? What's their love and affection for Jesus? And listen to me. What's their passion for holiness? The other things you can teach in many ways, or you can find other men who are maybe not yet qualified to be deacons to work on the roof and to take care of the yard and to get the projects done in the church. But the deacon, he has to have a desire for holiness and a deep love for the Lord. And this is another really important one. He has to love his wife and care for her wonderfully. I have been around, again, not in any churches that my dad served in or that even I served, but I've been around other deacons in churches I've worked with where I have seen deacons in public seem extremely godly and say the right things and pray the right way, but then turn to their spouse and say some really harsh and cutting things and be really rude to their spouse. That doesn't go well. Christ said to love your wife as Christ loved the church. And the scripture does say that deacon has to be one who cares well for his family.
That's
and
a
so
qualification.
He has to have a deep love for the Lord. And out of that will be a love for his family.
That's right. So mark number 1 is a love for God as a deacon. And then this leads naturally to the second mark.
And the love for God will exhibit itself in his love for prayer, his love for Bible study and reading,
worship.
His love for corporate worship, his love for his wife, his love for his children. It will not necessarily exhibit itself in his hard work ethic and his dependability around the church.
That's good.
Okay?
Well, listen, and that plays into mark number 2, which is a love for people.
Exactly.
Because you can be a guy who loves to work on the church and you're a handyman. That's great. But you're mean, man. You're not.
And you can be a guy who likes to be a puppet leader, puppet maker, is that what it is? Someone who can control the pastor. So you can be a guy who can get really close to the pastor, really be his best buddy, really support him. But what you're really trying to do is be the puppet master and sort of guide the church through the pastor.
That happens.
I have seen that in some churches. And so again, it has to go back to a deep and abiding love for the Lord and a deep and abiding love for people. Not a love for power or for control or for authority.
Good word. A love for people. Here's number 3, and this is foundational: humility. Deacons are servants of the Lord, and they're servants of God's people. They model, they follow the example of Christ. And so there's just no place for a prideful deacon. A deacon who wants power, a deacon who's about themselves. Deacons are called to be humble servants of God's people.
And we say all the time that the Lord opposes the proud, and he literally runs toward the humble.
That's right.
And we want deacons who exhibit humility and not pride.
That's right. Okay, so love for God, love for people, humility. Now here's a big one. Mark number 4, flexibility.
What's that look like?
Okay, flexibility. And I think, man, this is especially true in a revitalization context, is you've got to be able to go with the flow, man. You've got to be able to understand. You've got to show grace to people. You've got to understand that in the church, crazy stuff happens. Sometimes our plans have to change. Sometimes, yes, you could look at the physical building, a pipe's going to break, and it's going to mess some things up, and we've got to adapt to it. Sometimes people are a challenge, and you've got to be flexible in how we... And so, again, the opposite of that, I think, a deacon who is not flexible, who's not willing to go with the flow, to make adjustments or changes needed, who's high control, boy, they're going to struggle in serving the church. Because the church, man, we're just a mess. We're a bunch of broken people who need Jesus, and there has to be grace.
And sometimes that high control, they interpret that as, I'm here to protect the church.
Yeah.
Make sure nothing bad happens.
Yep.
Make sure we don't go off the rails. Make sure the pastor doesn't do something foolish.
Yeah.
So I'm here to sort of be the bulwark against any crazy ideas.
Yeah.
And so they get very entrenched.
Yeah.
And, I'm the protection. I'm the guardrail here. I'm the emergency brake.
Oh, yeah.
You don't want a deacon like that.
Yeah.
You want someone who sees where Jesus is at work and wants to jump in and follow that work.
That's right.
You want someone who operates from the balls of their feet, can pivot in a minute and say, man, the Lord's working here. Let's run toward that. Not someone who digs their heels in and says, I can give you 10 reasons why this wouldn't work.
Boy, that's
you
true.
want a Joshua and a Caleb, not the other 10 spies.
Yeah.
You don't want the 10 spies that can give you 100 reasons why we shouldn't go into the promised land.
Yep.
You want the Joshua and Caleb who say, we have heard from God, let's go up at once and take it because it belongs to us.
Boy,
that's
true.
what you need in leadership.
I love it.
And I remember Henry used to say, sometimes in looking for church leaders and deacons, we look in the business world. And we say, this guy runs a business well. This guy manages people well. There are times when those characteristics might transfer over to the church. But my friend Henry Blackaby says often they do not.
They don't.
Because the very cautiousness that man must exhibit in the secular business world is not the kind of opinion he must exhibit when it's the things of the Lord. There needs to be a willingness to take risk, to step out by faith, to be in the unknown, which goes completely against what a guy who runs a business has to do.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important.
Yeah, for
I think
sure.
sometimes people, this guy, he'd be a great deacon because he knows how to run a business.
Yep.
Well, a church is not a business.
Yeah.
It has a certain aspect of that. But that certain aspect is small compared to what we really are
That's
about. Right?
Yeah. We're the
And
people of God.
I think that's important.
No, that's good. So love for God is mark number 1. Number 2, love for people. 3 is humility. Number 4 is flexibility. And we would say number 5 is sacrifice. And sacrifice, I think this is honestly what separates, when I was reflecting on this and thinking about the most faithful deacons that I've been blessed to serve with over the years in ministry, are those who understand that that when you serve in the church, and this is true of pastors as well, there is sacrifice involved. It means this: I'm not putting my needs and my wants first. I'm putting the wants and needs of others before myself.
You sacrifice your time to some degree. I'm not comfortable with the word sacrifice your family, but to some degree it impacts your family. It has to be.
Yeah.
It also sacrifices, in many ways, I won't say it doesn't sacrifice your joy, but when you invest in broken and hurt people, you're going to share in that.
Yes, you will. That's right.
It's going to be painful at times.
Yeah, that's
you
right.
don't get the chance to just ignore people's pain and focus on your own life. You involve yourself in that pain.
Yeah, you enter into it.
You enter into it. Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Paul talked about, how he is burdened by all the churches that he cares for and prays for. You're going to be brought into that kind of an experience, and that is all a sacrifice, to be sure. The first time we ordained a group of elders at Warnell, I asked Don Whitney to come and to be there with us for that weekend and then lead us in the ordination.
Yeah.
I had a group of 3 or 4 young men, most of them in their late 20s, very godly young men who had all the qualities we just listed, right? They were all married, all the qualities we just listed. But they were busy. They had young families. Most of them, their wives were not working outside the home, so they had to work a lot of hours. Some of them had to work overtime. They had a lot they had to do. And so I remember we had breakfast Sunday morning before the worship service and the ordination. And in that breakfast, one of the young men, a very godly young man who has gone on to be a great deacon in another church in another town, and I'm just so proud of him, he said, Dr. Whitney, how am I going to do all of the things I need to do as an elder and take care of my family and my secular job? And Dr. Whitney said, you're just going to have to do it. There's no easy way around it. There's no way to make all of this simple. You're going to sacrifice some of your leisure time, some of your recreation time. some of the things you might otherwise do. Yes, there's a limited number of hours in the day. And if you're going to be committed to be an elder and to be a good employer and a great husband and father, it's going to take sacrifices.
That's right. Yep.
Now, at the end of the day, the reward for those sacrifices is immense, but you can't do it without sacrifice.
Man, that's
and I know it's such a good, and of course, that wasn't what they expected to hear.
Yeah, right.
I think they expected to hear, well, here's how you do that.
Yeah,
And I loved his honesty about that.
Yeah,
because he's absolutely right.
He's right. And the good news in that is we can't, listen, love for God, love for people, humility, flexibility, and sacrifice, we can't do any of that on our own strength. And yet the Lord, Jesus, will give us all that we need to live this kind of life out. This is the power of the gospel that's transforming us to become the kinds of leaders that he's called us to be. And so we trust in him. We trust in his sustaining grace. We trust in the power of the Spirit. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, man, I have a desire to serve, but I don't know if I can meet these requirements.
Well, you mentioned
right?
in your church, you get your guys get together every Monday from 5 to 6:30.
Yes, that's right.
Every Monday.
Yeah.
Well, that's a sacrifice.
That's a sacrifice.
And a lot of young this past week, I've got a grandson who is getting ready to go to Spurgeon College next year, and so he's coming to live with us for a while. He's 18 years old, and one of the elders has a Bible study at 6 a.m. I think it's on Thursday or something, Thursday morning, and so he was invited to it. So 6 a.m.
Yeah.
He gets up well before 6, my grandson does, drives to this guy's Bible study. Other men are there. These men are all going to go to work later that day.
Yep.
These are elders who realize,
right.
if I'm going to be an elder in a church, I'm going to get up earlier. I'm going to sleep less. I'm going to make this commitment. But at the end of the day, their life has purpose.
Yeah, that's right.
And the one thing that young men passionately want in life is purpose.
Yep.
And it gives them incredible purpose and reason to be, and a brotherhood of other young men who got up that early morning.
That's right.
We're committed to be. It's a great thing.
Yes, it is.
But it is a sacrifice.
It is a sacrifice. So those are 5 marks in this first part of this 2-part podcast. A love for God, a love for people, humility, flexibility, and sacrifice. Those are some of the marks of a deacon. And in the next episode, we're going to be kind of getting into the practical side of this and talk about some of the duties of a deacon. What does a deacon do? What are we equipping them to do in the church? And so until next time, thanks for joining us. Please subscribe and let some others know about it. We love you all very much.
Thank you for being here. That's right.
Thanks for joining us today on Revitalize and Replant. This podcast is brought to you by the North American Mission Board, where we help dying or struggling churches regain health for the glory of God and the good of their communities. If you found this conversation helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. To learn more about becoming a replanting pastor or to explore resources about revitalization for your own church, visit churchreplanters.com.